Afternoon, everyone. Just want to be sure before we get started, I understand that there was a change up in the schedule. So is everybody here? I can't see your hands, but if you're here for transportation, you're in the right place. There was apparently another session that was originally scheduled that was canceled that was dealing with education. So I just want to let everyone know. Now, if those of you who didn't plan to stay for transportation but are interested in it, we absolutely welcome you to stay. But just in case, we wanted to let everyone know that. We'll get started here in a second while everyone kind of situates themselves.
Where's social emotional learning finding common with chaos?
I am not sure where. Mm-hmm. So I'll give folks a couple minutes just to, if you're not interested in staying for transportation, then we'll get started on our end. Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. How's everybody doing today? Doing well? How are you guys enjoying the Family Cafe so far? How many of you, is this your first time to being here? Okay, all right, so I'm not alone on this. This is my first time. I've been working for the state of Florida for 11 years, and I still have yet to have experienced the Family Cafe, so welcome. I'm glad to be a part of this experience. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was kind of a surprise session that we had at the last minute, so I'm very, very proud to be here and talk about this very important topic. To introduce myself, my name is David Darm, and I oversee the program called the Commission for Transportation Disadvantaged, or CTD. We are the state program that oversees transportation services in each of the counties of the state. We fund the services as well as work with other agencies like APD and others to help provide and coordinate transportation for people with disabilities and other groups as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about, for those of you who are interested in learning about our program, I'm going to give you an overview about that. But more importantly, my goal in this presentation is actually to see how we as a society, as a group of advocates, because most of us, I believe, are here in some way or another as an advocate, because we all personally believe in trying to make things better for all of us as far as those of us who have disabilities. And so I am here actually not just as a professional, but I'm here also as a person with a disability. I am visually impaired. So one of the advantages to being visually impaired and being a presenter, I can't see any of your faces, which means that if I'm boring you, it does not faze me one bit. I can just keep talking. Also, I forgot to mention, I'm remiss to mention that my service animal here is accompanying me. His name is Ranger. So if at the end of the presentation, I will try to take questions the best I can. But if they're a difficult question, I'm just going to refer to Ranger and he'll take it for me. All right, I'm going to see if he'll cooperate with me. Sit. You may hear noises from Ranger during the afternoon. It's not because he's bored of my presenting. He's just very hungry. So we're going to see if he'll cooperate and let me do my thing. You going to stay there? Stay? Okay, good boy. I'm still trying to figure out how to get Ranger to become my autonomous vehicle and drive me places, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So before I get started to talk about this program, the Transportation Disadvantage, in ways you can get involved, I kind of want to share a personal story. As I mentioned, I am visually impaired, and I have lived with a disability all my life. And one of the things that I've learned, especially when I started working, when I started my career, I noticed that a lot of people would say, a lot of people without disabilities, full able-bodied individuals would say, yeah, you're really an inspiration, or man, it's really awesome what you do. And I didn't understand, because This was like when I was doing an internship and I was moving papers. I was answering the phones. I don't see what I did that made that inspiring. And then I started to understand this. As working in my field, I have spent the last 11 years in my career being an advocate for people with disabilities in the government side. And one of the things that I've learned, especially in the employment arena, but across all the areas that I served, that there was this idea that having a disability, in my case, my disability, was an exception, and that the norm was that most people with disabilities don't get to go to work, don't get to get out in the community, don't have a social life. They just sit at home and, maybe just feel sorry for themselves. And that's kind of a dramatic way of looking at it. But one of the things that I believe in my heart and why I'm here at this conference and why I believe many of you are here is that we know that's not true. That we as people with disabilities, we're no different than anybody else. Yeah, we might have some challenges in our life that we have to overcome that might be unique to us, but we all want to do the same things as everybody else. We want to have a good job, we want to go to school or get out of school, and we want to be able to have a normal life, a social life, having all the things that everybody else has. And so as part of that, transportation serves as the link to every aspect of our daily lives. You want to go to a job, how do you get there? You need to go to the doctor's office, how are you going to get there? You want to be able to go to the pub or the bar or the football game or whatever social activity you enjoy, how are you going to get there? So transportation touches on all these aspects. And as my role and my part of this, and not just being a person who's had to overcome my own transportation barriers, but also to be in the public service arena, it's my job to be a voice for those who maybe not necessarily can speak up for themselves. So part of this presentation is not just to understand what transportation options exist, but also how to be an advocate and speak on behalf of others who may not necessarily know how to navigate this complicated system. So I wanted to start with this quote from, I grew up in a very religious family, and one of the things that I grew up learning was about this book called The Purpose-Driven Life, and this author who wrote it was talking about what is the role of influence? Because in this case, I have been interested in pursuing a role of leadership in government. And so I believe that my role as an influence is to speak for those who don't have a voice. So in the case of the Transportation Disadvantage Program, we speak for a group of individuals. We are trying to be a voice for them because they may not necessarily have that same ability to advocate for themselves, or they may have limited ability to advocate for themselves. So who are the people that we serve? Well, like I said, we serve individuals with disabilities. We also have older adults who are losing, whether it's the ability to see, or they have another kind of physical constraint, or even a mental disability that's invisible that would prevent them from being able to drive themselves, to physically drive themselves. We also serve individuals who have a financial barrier to transportation, who can't afford it. And we'll talk a little bit about when we look at transportation options in your community, some of them are very, very affordable for the most part, but they may not be the highest of quality of transportation. But then there's other trips out there that might be really great, like Uber or Lyft, but they're very expensive, and those individuals may not have the ability to access those because of their financial constraints. So we serve quite a broad group of people. So what is the activities that we look at in terms of support? What are the challenges that they're facing? Well, we're very fortunate because we look at everything across the board in our program. People who have barriers to transportation, like I mentioned at the beginning, it touches on every aspect of our lives. So going to work, independent living, healthcare, social activities, grocery shopping, you name it, our program looks at ways that we can address these challenges across the board. So how does our program work? What was the state of Florida's approach to trying to address these challenges? Well, I got to start with back in 1979, actually before the Americans with Disabilities Act, we, as a state, we wanted to be ahead of the game. We wanted to be a leader in the nation in terms of trying to get this issue addressed, this big problem of transportation. You see, as we all know, Florida is growing as a state. Even back in the 70s, it was growing as a state. And we understood that there were communities bigger, and we were becoming more urbanized, we were becoming bigger, and that meant there was more, maybe more public transportation, meaning buses that might have been available, but that still wasn't addressing the needs of people with disabilities and other groups that were probably going to be limited. And not only that, but not everybody lives in a large urbanized area like downtown Orlando or Miami. And so the state recognized that we need to look at this from a statewide perspective to look at all the folks that we serve and find ways that we can to invest in transportation options across the state. It's not dinner time, I'm sorry. Sit down. Lay down. You were good for I knew it would have been at some point he was going to get up. All right, I'll stay over here if that makes you feel better. So the Florida legislature created the Transportation Disadvantage Program, or TD, as our acronym goes, to really find a way to invest and create more transportation across the state, all 67 counties. In addition to understanding what was limited in terms of public transportation, meaning bus-type trips, the other issue was we also knew there were many programs like Medicaid and what today is now known as APD's Medicaid waiver that were providing some kinds of transportation, meaning in the case of Medicaid, they would pay for a trip to the doctor's office. So we knew there were some programs out there that were doing this, but if you were on Medicaid, you could get a trip, you had access to maybe health care, but how would you get to the grocery store? Was there an opportunity for you to be able to get that? Because Medicaid wouldn't pay for that at the time. So our program was recognizing that there wasn't what we term as coordinated effort, meaning there wasn't a way of looking at everything across the system and touching all the aspects of somebody's life. And so our program was designed to say we've got to figure out a way as a community and as a state, how do we pull these sources together to see if we can make more options available, more transportation available, and not just hitting only on employment or just medical or just certain other activities. Okay, so that was kind of the initial start of the program. The program was sort of understanding there was needs and there needed to be a coordinated effort to meeting those needs, but it wasn't enough because even with what Medicaid was paying for or what today's APD's program was paying for, there still wasn't enough of a system in place. So we, in 10 years after the creation of the TD program, the legislature created what was called the Transportation Disadvantage Trust Fund. So it was a dedicated funding source because how many of you are familiar with the company Aflac? You know, most probably, how many of you probably even know what that company does? Because a lot of times, a lot of people just know about it from the duck, but they don't know actually what the company does. And I usually say when I go around and educating folks about our program, I say we're the Aflac of transportation. And what that means is we're like insurance. So if you get transportation paid for by a certain program or you get maybe like bus services in certain ways, theirs are very limited. So our funding will kick in to help somebody, let's say, who doesn't get trips to the grocery store, as I mentioned in that earlier scenario. Our funding would go to support that, while Medicaid pays for the trips to the doctor's office. So the legislature in '89 created this dedicated funding source, and it has been there to this day, and we manage that, and we oversee the funding. We distribute funding every year to all the counties of the state of Florida to provide these types of transportation. Okay, so that's kind of like, again, big picture, what is this program about, and how does it made up? But then how do we actually make it happen? How do we provide, who are these organizations that we work with to provide at the ground level, at the local level, these transportation services? We call them, in our organization, we call them Community Transportation Coordinators, or CTCs. I promise that will be the last acronym I think you'll hear today. CTCs are organizations that are set up all over each of the counties of Florida, So if you live here in Orlando, the CTC for Orlando is links. These are either, they could be a transit agency, it could be a local government, or it could be a not-for-profit. It could be a council on aging. There are varying types of groups depending on which county you live in. And it's these organizations that are responsible for figuring out how to coordinate the transportation services for the local area. So though we give them funding, they're not just responsible for our funds, but they also may work with other agencies to try to coordinate those services in their community. And I also I wanted to introduce my colleague here, John Irvin. He has some information here. We got a booth set up out at the exhibit. So if you're interested in learning more about these organizations, especially to find the one in your community, we have that information over here. We had a pamphlet that has all of them by name, and I believe their contact information, right? Right, so if you're interested in actually finding them, we have that information over here. But just again, this is kind of a high-level overview of what this entails. So when it comes to transportation services, the nitty-gritty, what are the kind of services that we provide? And it really kind of falls into three groups, three categories. One is, and the most common one that we pay for, is called paratransit or door-to-door. Many of you might have heard of, more familiar with it as dial-a-ride-like services. Those are the trips that you schedule, usually have to schedule them about 24 hours or so in advance. And they will go to your door or your curb, pick you up, take you to your destination. You have to schedule that, and so you arrange that with the provider. Another type of transportation service that is kind of becoming the more trendy transportation is called on-demand, which means, as it sounds, you're wanting to get somewhere immediately. More commonly known, a lot of people are familiar with this more like Uber and Lyft type style of service, where you get it immediately when you make the request. So that would be an on-demand, and that's something that we want to see more of in our program. But of course, with that comes with a cost. It's a little more expensive. So we're trying to figure out how can we make that reasonable. And then third is for those who have the ability to ride a fixed bus, which means that it's the bus that you're familiar with. It's the ones that you go to the bus stop and you wait and you know the schedule. A lot of times, a lot of our customers that we serve, they can physically ride the bus. They may prefer to ride the bus, but they may not be able to afford to do that all the time. So we provide what's called bus passes. It means it's basically we're paying for you to be able to ride that service with a low or no cost at all on you so that you can be able to ride it. And again, that's usually for folks who can be able to physically access it. And you know, I even myself in my community in Tallahassee, there were many times where I actually preferred to use the bus because I didn't like waiting an hour to get picked up. And as long as the weather wasn't, scorching hot like it is this month, we would be able to use that. So this is kind of an overview of our program. Now that's kind of the boring stuff. I want to get to more of the exciting part, which is how do we as a community address the challenges when I think most everybody in this room is familiar that this is a very difficult problem that we face as a group of community of people with disabilities. Even today, I am fully independent. I have a really good paying job. I'm able to go to most places. I'm actually very blessed that I'm in a community that has a lot of pedestrian paths. But even still, to this day, I still struggle with sometimes navigating these transportation options. And so we want, as a group, it can't just be the Florida Commission for Transportation Disadvantage solving all the problems. It's just not realistic. We, as a community, as a society, and as a state, have a way we can be able collectively to solve these problems. And of course, it's going to vary from which one you're trying to address. But I wanted to lay out a few ideas that you could take back to your community as advocates to how we can, as a group, solve these problems or understand these problems better. And so this is kind of a list, and I'm going to go through each one really briefly here. But number one, and most importantly, we have to start with the customer's needs. So I'm going to take a little deviated course here before I get into this. in addition to the transportation service arena that I've been passionate about, my second great passion has been employment and jobs. Before I did this, I was actually an advocate. I worked for, at the time, Governor Rick Scott, and we did a lot about employer outreach and educating about hiring people with disabilities. And one of the things that I learned when I was doing that job, it was kind of interesting. I would get this question constantly from certain people who had no idea they didn't know anything about working with people with disabilities, and they would say, well, what kind of jobs are out there for people with disabilities? Like there was this group of jobs that just was segmented to the side, and everybody there, that was just for people with disabilities. And that there was no other jobs out there like that. And my response, because I am also kind of sarcastic, and I would say, well, for me personally, my best job that I'm qualified for is NASCAR. I wanted to be a NASCAR driver. And then I would say, no, I was kidding. I was just kidding. I meant heart surgeon. That was what I wanted to do. And of course, I'm not serious about that. And I would not be qualified to be a heart surgeon or a NASCAR driver because I'm visually impaired. But then again, there's a lot of people I know who are fully sighted who aren't qualified for that job either. And so the reason why I brought that up was because when we're looking at what's the best kind of job or option or any aspect of a person's life, we have to understand that everybody's different. Everybody has different interests. Everybody has different challenges. And so you can't box a whole group of people into one group and say, okay, so everybody who has a disability, the only option they should have is paratransit. That's not a realistic expectation. So we have to change the way we think as when we're trying to problem solve, especially on a more global level. How do we help create more options and opportunities for people to learn about transportation options that are best kind of for their needs? So it's really important that we start with the individual's needs and work over to the transportation that is available or needs to be available. So in my case, I use the kind of going to the transportation side for my personal life. Paratransit, when I started my job, when I started my career, was the only option I could really do because I couldn't afford to go to do a taxi or eventually Uber every single day because I would go bust on my budget. So I needed to be able to use paratransit to go to work because I knew, at least for the most part, it was reliable when it came to getting me there on time for the most part. But I didn't want to do that all the time. I didn't want to be scheduling to go to the grocery store or to a social activity every time I needed to go there. So I had to work alternative options for the other activities I wanted to do, like using a friend or a coworker to drive me to the grocery store, arranging it with them. And like I said, I mentioned it earlier, I'm in the downtown area of Tallahassee. Is pretty pedestrian friendly. They've built it up a lot. And that's another issue that we're going to talk about. Like when you talk about trying to problem solve, looking what the community's role can be to helping address that. And in my case, I was fortunate that a lot of the social activities that I like to access are right by FSU's campus, and I can be able to walk to it. So it works for me. But that's not to say that my situation is everybody's situation. So we have to understand, how does each individual's needs in some global sense can be understood before we get to what do we do to make this transportation situation better for us as a group. So after we understand the individual's needs, the second step is to understand what does exist. And this requires an inventory. It requires some research to understand what does exist in your community. And as I mentioned, usually the first option is public transportation. That's usually the first step to understanding what you have, especially because it's usually the most affordable. It doesn't mean it's always the highest quality, but it's usually affordable. So asking is there what's called a fixed route, the bus service that goes from bus stop to bus stop and is scheduled. Is that something that is accessible to you if you have the ability to use it? Some people, they prefer that, but others don't. And so in that case, an extension of that is the paratransit. I was talking about that. Scheduling trips, going door to door. So that sort of the benefit of that, instead you don't have to go down to the bus stop and have to figure out how to transfer from bus to bus. That's the advantage of paratransit. The disadvantage is that sometimes you have to wait for almost an hour sometimes to get picked up. So that is the downside of paratransit, especially when there is a lot of people who use it. These systems have to figure out how to meet everybody's needs, and it can be really cumbersome when you're trying to meet too many at once. So in addition to public transportation, then looking at what other options exist might be private for you. Taxis were the kind of traditional way of looking at it, but recently we have Uber and Lyft, which are known as transportation network companies, and we've been hearing a lot of that, especially I think during the pandemic, how those services have been kind of reaching out and further in more of their communities. So that might be a reasonable option, but again, even though you might like those services, you need to be also aware that, when it comes to safety, being sure you understand that you're riding with a stranger, also understanding there is cost to those services. So you may be spending, $15 to $20 versus $2.50 to be able to use that service compared to paratransit. So again, understanding your options is important here. In addition to that, there may be what we call human service transportation. So you may work with an ARC chapter or a Center for Independent Living. I'm not sure if they provide transportation, but they may know types of transportation that a smaller agency might be providing to a specific activity, like a daycare program. So, looking at those options, if you are working with an agency to serve your needs in maybe another way, they may provide transportation depending on how robust their program is. So, and then again, there's always considering even mobility options if it's reasonable and it fits in your community. What are the pedestrian paths and what are the other options that could be used besides the physical or the actual transportation in itself? So that's why we talk about mobility over just transportation. Mobility is the broad sense of being able to access activities, not just to be able to physically drive somewhere, but could you actually walk somewhere? And so again, I live in a really great community, I think, that has recognized that, especially with the college campus, that they're trying to cut down on people driving all the time, so they have to make that work as an infrastructure. So again, these are options to consider. They may not be available, they may be available, but they may be limited. So once you kind of understand what does exist, then the fun part begins. How do we see where these options aren't meeting the needs? So, and this requires partnerships, working with a group of people, a group of organizations to try to solve this problem. And again, it's not going to take one organization, it's not going to take one provider to make it work collectively for everyone. We have to work as a team. Now, I am a big comic book nerd, and I've been just geeking out like crazy over the last few years with Marvel, and I had to bring it in some here. So I hope that I don't violate a copyright here by putting it up here. But I did want to put this example because I don't know how many of you, again, I can't see your hands, but just for the fun of it, how many of you are big fans of the Marvel universe lately? Been watching the comics? All right, so when the Avengers got together, did these folks just get along? No. They're all really egotistical. They all have their own ideas of how to solve a problem, and they usually clash because one has an idea that's totally different from the other person's idea. So how do you get Iron Man and Thor and the Hulk and Captain America to get along? You have to have a common goal, or in their case, a common threat, Thanos or Loki. And in the same way, transportation or any major change that you want to bring about in your community, social issue you want to address, requires every of these groups. They all may have different interests. They all may have very different personalities. And let me tell you, in public service, you meet some interesting personalities that you probably don't want to work with if you just had it your way, but you have to work with them. And so how do we bring them together? We understand that we all share this common challenge. We all need transportation. Even if you have the physical ability to drive, you still need transportation. And so how do we make that benefit the whole of our society and not just certain segments of the society? How do you solve these problems? By bringing them together and saying, okay, how are we going to address this as a group? In our program, we have set up, each community has what's called a local transportation disadvantage board. And those boards are made up of elected officials. They're really important, obviously. We need elected officials to help us manage the programs or the funding. But we also have planning organizations. Those are the ones that are usually designing the cities, the infrastructure. So I was talking about like Tallahassee, for example. You know, the planning is a major role in terms of access to public transportation. We also have workforce development boards. Those are the ones that work on the employment side. It's a business community. So they're important as far as understanding their role in this, especially when we talk about access to employment. And then most importantly, we need advocates, the people who are actually personally affected by this, whether because they have a disability or because they're a family member or a friend, and this is just something that impacts them through that relationship. And so we bring these groups together. We try to bring these groups together at least periodically to try to hash out these problems in their community. So once we understand, again, we need to bring the groups together. We need to solve this problem as a society, as a community. I'd say the most challenging step in this whole process is then evaluating, especially if we start identifying a service program. And with ours, I noticed this is a particularly challenging issue because oftentimes we'll see services that will be really, really popular, right? Okay, like on-demand services I talked about at the beginning are really, really popular. Everybody wants those. But then you also have to understand that they're very expensive, and there's only so much money can go to addressing that. So how do you keep it going? You have to evaluate what is your cost, how much is it costing the community or the state to invest in that. And then on the other side of it, you look at the quality side, which is those sticking issues that we hate to hear about. We hate them. We hate hearing this. Almost every conference we'll hear somebody say, I got left. I made my scheduled appointment and then I went to my job and then they didn't pick me up. We got to figure out where are those cases happening and try to use data to inform us how to stop it. And it takes an honest look, ensuring that we're doing what we're trying to accomplish. And no system is perfect, but data helps us to be able to say, let's move it, and the needle needs to move in a certain direction. Is that happening? One other thing to consider is that as we evolve, we're hearing a lot today about technology, which is exciting. We had transportation network companies like Uber come on the scene, and maybe 6 years ago, that was the big rage. Now everyone's talking about electric vehicles, and soon it will be hopefully autonomous vehicles. So these are really exciting things that are coming along the way. Of course, we need to also be cautious and watch them as they happen. But at the same time, as these technologies are happening, are our other services evolving with those technologies? Are we able to move past the 1990s? I usually joke about this. I'll say in government, while everyone's on 5G, we're operating still on dial-up, if you can remember that. So this is really something that I'm striving to, as a leader of my organization, to bring more into our activities, is evaluating using data to try to help us understand where could these services be improved upon. And then finally, what can you do? This is going right back, circling back to the beginning of my presentation where I talked about the purpose of influence is to speak for others. And I want to close with using another role model that I grew up with, Fred Rogers, if any of you remembered Mr. Rogers. Well, many of us think of Mr. Rogers in his show when we were children, but we don't usually think about Mr. Rogers as a public servant. But he actually, I really highly recommend you see this video. It's on YouTube. Back, I don't even remember when it was, but it was when his show was starting to kick off the ground. His entire program was funded, largely, not entire, but most of it was funded by public taxpayer dollars. And the Congress was looking to make cuts as it works and how it works in the system. And he had some critics that were saying, why are we investing in this program? And he went up and spoke. Now his speech, which was incredibly inspiring, he goes up, he didn't talk about himself. He didn't talk about how he needed the job, he needed the money. He was talking about who he represented as a person of his show. And it was, he was a voice for children because children couldn't speak for themselves the way he could speak on their behalf. And they deal with issues that would impact their lives, you know, into adulthood. And there, you would hear cases today of adults that were impacted as children by this person. And because of this speech that he gave, and why I bring it up is because by the end of this, when he was facing a critical group, not only did they change their mind, but they became advocates for his program because we all were children at some point, and we all had to wrestle with the challenges that Mr. Rogers was trying to help these children deal with, like feelings of anger. What do you do with that? And why I bring that up is because, as I mentioned, we all have the need for transportation. Somebody may not think of it at first as that's an issue that affects them, whether they're an elected official or a business leader or any other group that may not be in our world all the time. They may not face this like we face this. But it's our responsibility as advocates and as leaders of our own to get them to understand why it's important to all of us as a society. So I emphasize that importance of advocacy means also being integral, being a person of character, being able to listen, not just to be a voice, but to listen. That's a big challenge sometimes, especially when we're very passionate, but being able to understand where, how we can work together as a society with sometimes those difficult personalities. And at the end, when we get to this point, bringing more advocates along with us. So, like I said, it's not just that we're the ones that are speaking and advocating, but we bring others that will become champions of our program or our issue as well. So I'll leave you with these are resources that you can look at. Of course, our website is on there, and you'll be able to find, again, our program, the CTCs that we work with. We've also provided a couple other ideas for you to look at in your community about designing transportation options, working with these types of groups. So the National Center for Mobility Management, that's a program that we work with at the national level. They have a lot of great resources out there, so if you're interested in really getting engaged in this, they have some really good material out there. So, and with that, I will do the best I can to answer questions, but like I said, if I can't answer them, you're gonna have to talk to Ranger. So, but yeah, thank you all for being here. I appreciate anybody who wasn't planning to be here actually stayed with us. So, are there any questions? I won't be able to see your hand. You'll just have to yell out.
Have you worked with local governments for grants for small vehicles transportation?
We worked with local governments. I didn't get the rest of that. I'm sorry.
Worked with local governments for grants to develop small vehicles. Like for instance, I know one in particular is called Freebie.
Uh-huh.
Down in Miami, and it's for a small municipality, and basically for the residents, it's quarterly pickup and drop off within the community, and that gets you around.
Well, I don't know about that specific program, but we do work, we do have a lot of, what we do with our funding, a lot of them will have the local governments that will match that funding. And as a part of that, they will also find because we pay for the actual service. That's what our program primarily does. But a lot of our CTCs will also get grants from whether it's the local or the federal level to do what you're talking about, where they're trying to make their vehicles maybe smaller or more accessible. So, it may vary from community to community, but yeah, we do have, in fact, we also do a conference every year, and we try to get the varying types of technologies and vehicles that will be available to our providers that they can be able to explore. So we do collaborate with them, even though our program doesn't pay for those. We will get them to work together. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John, you want to take that?
Yeah, there's an organization that we deal with through the Department of Transportation called Save Mobility for Life, and we maintain a website called Find a Ride Florida. So if you Google Find a Ride Florida, there's a database that has all the resources in your community for transportation. That includes the public ones, private, faith-based, volunteer, any transportation service available. It's on that website. It tells you what their rules are and that sort of thing.
Do we have a flyer on that at the at the booth on?
I gave out earlier, but if you Google one word, Find a Ride Florida, you'll find the website. I ran out of pamphlets earlier from our display for that particular thing, but it's called Find a Ride Florida.
Mm-hmm. Good question.
I think it's .org, but if you Google it, it'll come up. It's through, it's maintained through the University of Florida out of Gainesville. They maintain the website for us with all the data in it to make sure it stays up to date. But it has all the resources in there. You can choose what you would like. You can choose the
Any other questions?
What can you tell us about what we can do to save grants that have now become unfunded?
Let me guess. You're referring to the one in St. Lucie County. Well,
Kidney dialysis and others.
yeah. Okay. So for those, just to kind of give the background on that one, we have a special program in our grant program called the Innovation and Service Development Grant, and we had that funding tied with a larger program that was much broader and had nothing to do with the services that I'm talking about here today, and that was the legislature repealed that program, and that was had nothing to do with us, but it was because the funding was wrapped in that. It was just a part of that and under that. So my recommendation, one is, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, it's not just the state that funds it. The state has a big role to play. And so there is a role that you can play as an advocate by educating your legislators about this program and trying to look for ways that the state could be able to support it. That's one option. But also looking at, in the case of St. Lucie County, I know that they're looking, and I can't make promises because they're still trying to figure it out, but St. Lucie County can also be able to maybe potentially work their own local systems to try to figure out an alternative to our funding if the funding isn't there again. The other options, we have other groups that we work with. The Florida Developmental Disabilities Council, I know, pays for some types of projects. These projects are usually meant to be like pilot projects. We're trying new services. And so there's a broader issue here, which is that when we get new services like that project you mentioned, they're usually good to start with and they're really exciting. But then when they become popular, how do we maintain them? Because as you just saw, funding doesn't always happen all the time. So how do we make that work? And so that's, I think, where it goes back to the planning and working as a community through your local coordinating board, your local TD board. How do you maintain that? Because if the state can't pay for it all the time, where do you get these other partners to chip in? So we really want that to be a thought, especially with this recent event, that, for whatever reason, sometimes it just doesn't happen. The state had the pandemic. Nobody prepared for that. Nobody was expecting that. And so, when situations like that occur, it's important that we, especially at the community level, figure out what other ways could we make it work as a backup plan. So I wish I could give you like a hard answer of exactly what to do, what number to call, but I think it's a bunch of options that you have to kind of consider, explore, and persistence also pays off. So just continue to be. Yes. That's very important too, is being able, having personal accounts of how the service has impacted you. I can go and talk to legislators about how our program works, but I'm not going to have as much influence as you because you are the ones that are actually getting impacted by the services. So it's really important that they not just have the hard data that I could give them, but the stories that you as a person who's been, your lives have been affected by this. So that's just, collaboration is really key in these kinds of things. Mm-hmm.
And that was findarideflorida.org. Don't look it up, it's .org.
So findaride.org. Sorry, findarideflorida.org.
Florida spelled all the way out.
Any other questions or comments? Somebody in the back?
You can lose all your money because I bought some Caribbean, but we have like no money.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear it all.
Vehicle? Are you trying to attend your own vehicle?
Yes.
Clay County? Manatee. Okay. Let's see if can we talk with them after? I don't know if we can be able to help, but maybe it might be a little bit more.
I think she came by and talked to me earlier, and it's a program that's provided, they provided no transportation to it, and so they cut off the transportation. So now, we have to reach out to Manatee County to see if they would provide it, possibly tonight, but I don't know. Usually if you have a program designed for someone, you need to also include in your budget the transportation, because you're building a program with people who have nowhere to go. So how do you expect them to come to something that there's no money to support it? Can't do it. And that's an everyday trip.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? I didn't realize we still have 10 minutes, but if you. That's yes. Mm-hmm. We're right next to FAST. It's right next to the booth of FAST. It's like when you go in that entrance way, it's right on the first row, where the registration booth is, that side.
And do you have handouts there?
Yes.
And I've got some here.
Yes, we have the list of our organizations we work with directly, and so we'll give you that, but also we have other material over there at that booth. Well, I think we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up early. Again, thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing any of you who can make it to the booth. We'll sit around if you want to talk individually about any of your issues. So, thank you.